Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Justine, and I will be your host for this last sustainability seminar of 2020. For the one who joined us for the first time, the Sustainability Seminar Series was initiated by Iman, the President of Students for Sustainability, and is a platform that aimed to boost interdisciplinary engagement on trending sustainability issues. So before starting the introduction of today's speaker, I would like to share with you some of the amazing news that students of sustainability have. Our student society has been selected amongst more than 160 applications to participate to the Global University Climate Forum by Yale University. So a square mission will be to reduce campus dining burdens on the climate using the UNEP Green Nudge approach. So be prepared to see some sustainable changes, hopefully, within the campus diner in the next coming 6 months. If you're interested in helping us, please don't hesitate to get in touch. So I put at the bottom of the screen as well our email address. We are always looking for volunteers to make this new goal a reality. Then going back to today's seminar, I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Matthew McCabe in the field of environmental science and engineering. He started his academic career in Australia with the completion of a PhD in civil and environmental engineering in the University of Newcastle in Australia, before moving to the US for a postdoc in Princeton University, followed by a second postdoc in the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Then he moved to KAUST in 2012 in the Water Desalination and Reuse Center, that is now the current associate director. And before, he was an associate professor in the University of New South Wales in Australia. While preparing this introduction, I discovered that there were many Matthews McCabe around the world. I found a music technologist and a medical philosopher, amongst others, and I thought that mixing technology and disciplines could be a common trait of the Matthew McCabe. Indeed, Professor McCabe's research is based on using multidisciplinary approaches to answer global issues. With his group, Professor McCabe is combining enhanced Earth observation and data model integration to address issues related to water, food security, and climate change. One of his solutions is to improve precision agriculture, for instance, by tailoring the water use of a field depending on the plant demand. Professor McCabe has been involved in a number of international research and coordination activities, such as the D20, the WCRP, GCOS, and GOX, and he is also an inaugural specialty chief editor of Frontier in Artificial Intelligence. I would like to remind our audience that we will have a 20-minute Q&A session at the end of the talk, where you will be able to raise your hand and drop questions in the chat box. Professor, thank you so much again for making some time for us today, and I will leave the screen to you.
Okay, thanks, Justine. Let me get this shared. Okay, can you see the full screen presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, thanks, Justine, for the nice introduction, and Iman for the invitation. It's a real great pleasure to be part of this sustainability seminar series, and I think it's even better that it's being run and organised by the students here at KAUST. You know, as I'm sure you've realised and recognised, that many of the problems that we're going to be talking about, not just today, but I'm sure in many of the other talks that have been given and those that will come in the future, are problems that it's the younger generation that are going to have to deal with. You know, it's my generation and the one before that created them, and it's your generation and the one after that's going to solve them, hopefully. So for the talk today, I thought I'd actually present kind of a big picture overview of some of the challenges and issues associated with, you know, probably the biggest driver of environmental change in the world today. and that's our food production systems. Now, given that it's a multidisciplinary audience, and as Justine sort of mentioned, I've got a multidisciplinary interest, it's deliberately a broad presentation. So I'm going to be covering a few different aspects. But towards the end, I actually do want to try and focus in a little bit on, some key points of the title. The sustainable intensification and the need for a digital transformation in agriculture. Now, it sounds like a pretty strange title, but it's pretty simple when it all comes down to it. How do we grow food, and what are some of the tools that we can use to improve that? And it's a digital transformation bit that I'm going to draw upon some examples from my own group's work and some of the other activities that we pursue here at KAUST, and particularly how we can use that to better quantify what we term the water-food nexus. And I'm going to give some examples of how it's almost impossible to consider these systems as singular units. There's an interconnectedness amongst all of it. And much of what I'm going to be talking about relates to this issue. UN projections indicate that we'll have anywhere between 9 and 10 billion people living on Earth by 2050. It's an extra 2 billion people over the next 30 years. Now, there are arguments on the precise number of that, but what we do know is that the majority of these 2 billion people are going to be born in the developing world. And there are many big questions that come up when you think of how Earth can manage an extra 2 billion people. We're struggling to manage it now. How are we going to manage an extra 2 billion people in the future? That sustainability is usually at the heart of those types of questions. Now, KAUST was really designed to address big questions, and this is one of the biggest. How do we achieve food and water security? How do we ensure that we can feed that extra 2 billion people over the next 30 years? Now, there have been some estimates that suggest we'll need to increase food production anywhere between 50 and 100% on current levels. So potentially twice as much food as we currently produce. And you'll notice that I've included food and water in this question because, as I'm going to explain through examples, the two are really inextricably linked. Now, I also want to make sure that everyone realizes that this is not just a problem of the future. I talked before about generations past creating problems for the generation in the future. Well, this is actually one of those problems that needs an answer right now. In 2020, there's more than 800 million people are undernourished, and about the same lack access to safe drinking water. This is a problem that needs a solution right now, not in 30 years' time. And like any big problem, there are many elements involved in that question. And I could easily add energy into the mix. I could talk about climate. And that's kind of where this slide provides a little bit of overview. It might surprise many of you to know that the food sector is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases after electricity production. We've cleared or converted more than 1/3 of the Earth's entire land surface. And that's almost entirely been cleared for agriculture. So this is kind of lesson one of the presentation. You can rarely, if ever, solve big problems by focusing on just one element. They're all interlinked and often feed back on each other. Now, any sustainable solution to that big problem needs to satisfy the social, environmental, and economic impacts. And that can be a juggling act at the best of times, and it's an inordinately difficult path to weave. Now, in this talk, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to focus just on one element of this triad, the environmental impact. And if you were paying attention to the last slide, that's exactly what I said not to do. But I've only got 45 minutes here, and I want to spend the time on what I know most about, which is, going back to the title, how Earth observation data can help us address and answer aspects of this food and water security challenge. But before I do that, I want to give a bit of a background and scope so that we're all starting from the same initial conditions. This is not an audience I can throw questions at, so I'm going to assume a level of knowledge, and hopefully you're going to learn something new from it. Now, we all know, I think, that the Earth's covered by about 70% water, the Earth's surface at least. Now, if you collect all that water into a single bubble, it works out actually about 1/1000th of the volume, which kind of gives a very different perspective of our blue planet. Now, of course, 97% of that big bubble that you see here, that's salty ocean water. Only 3% of that is fresh or usable water. And that's what we see in that second smallest sphere here. But most of that is actually trapped in ice sheets or deep underground. It's not accessible. The accessible water, the water we use on a daily basis, is that little dot that you can barely see. I've zoomed into it in the bottom right-hand side there. Now, in reality, it's less than 1% of our fresh water. So 1% of that 3% is readily available for human use. And around 2/3 of that goes towards growing our food and raising our animals. All right, now, I know I've thrown a lot of percentages and fractions at you, but that's an important one. 2/3 of all of that fresh water that's readily accessible goes towards food and raising animals. Now, I'm not trying to freak anyone out here. In absolute volumes, this is still a huge amount of water. Talking about 100,000 cubic kilometers of water in that tiny little bubble. It's more than enough for everyone, right? But it's not sitting in a nice little bubble that we can access whenever we want. That means that not all places get an equal share. And that causes problems, particularly where we think about where we're growing our food. And I'm going to explore that a little bit further in the following slides. You can sort of see explicitly in this figure, the disparity of that water distribution. And what we're seeing here is basically the relative water stress of each country. Now, in this case, we're defining water stress as the point where the amount of water that you withdraw from lakes, rivers, or groundwater, the accessible fresh water that you might have in a country, is greater than the minimum requirement. And the minimum requirement is around 1,400 cubic meters. That's the volume that sustains human or ecosystem requirements. Now, it's probably no big surprise that the Middle East, which you can see here, is water stressed. You know where we live. It's a very dry and inhospitable environment in many ways. But so too are India, China, and large parts of Africa, some of our near neighbors in geographic sense. And those countries account for nearly half of the world's population. But even this map doesn't really do the water stress problem justice. We don't generally think of water stress on a national scale. We feel it at the local to regional scale. So we need to see that type of level to understand the real impact. And this is where satellite data can be really powerful. They help us map and monitor this type of variability in a spatially explicit way. Now, this slide shows global water declines in groundwater, but also freshwater stores from a particular satellite mission, the GRACE satellite. It's the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. Now, if you want to learn more about the system, we can talk about it at the end, but Jay Femiglietti, one of the co-authors of this paper, actually gave a talk to the NC program early in the year where he presented some information on water security. So I would encourage you all to go and look for that on YouTube, or we can post the link after this talk. Now, when you grow food, you generally have two ways to grow it. You either use rain-fed agriculture, or you engineer a system that diverts fresh water, and that's irrigation. Now, one of the trends we see from GRACE and also in other satellite systems is the strong overlap between irrigated lands and groundwater depletion. Basically, we're using groundwater faster than it can be replenished. And that has major implications for food security. It has those implications because irrigated lands are super important for securing national food supplies. They make up only 20% of farmland, but produce more than 40% of our food. But there are lots of challenges with irrigation. It's not something we just roll out everywhere. And we're going to see some examples right here in Saudi. So it's not as simple as turning all of our farmlands into irrigated lands. But before I turn our attention to some of the local issues and examples that my group's been working on, I wanted to introduce a concept that some of you may already know about. And it's one that draws a direct link between food and water. It's called the virtual water concept. And what it does, it formalizes the idea that an item, particularly a manufactured item, has water entrapped in it as part of its production. Now you can think about nearly any product, from a cup of coffee to a pair of jeans. There's going to be water involved in every aspect of the processing chain in the development of that product. And it's especially true for food, which is what we're focusing on today. Now, illustrate some examples here in the slide. You can look for yourself, but consider a 500 gram packet of rice. It takes 1,700 litres of water to produce that, or 1,000 litres of water to produce a single litre of milk. So every time you go into a supermarket, you pick up a litre of milk from the shelf, or two litres of milk. That's 2,000 litres of water potentially that's been entrapped or embedded in that food product. Well, look at the water used to produce red meat. 4,500 litres for a single 300 gram steak. And that's one I'm going to return to later on in the talk. So when we talk about sustainable food production, we definitely need to think about sustainable water resources as well. You can't have one without the other. Now, that virtual water, it's a very powerful concept, particularly if you want to understand the value of water. There was a study by Carol Dalen and a couple of other co-authors who tracked food trade by country to produce this sort of really nice figure on the right. The numbers that you see here, they represent cubic kilometers of embedded water. So a cubic kilometer, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer of water. It's a billion meters cubed. And they track that amount of water that's tied up in the international exchange of food. And that's what you see in the colored ribbons. The colored ribbons indicate the country of export. So it's a little bit complicated, but we can track an example. Say, Mexico in green at the bottom. They're exporting almost 1.5 cubic kilometers of embedded groundwater in their food trade to the US. The US is sending back around a cubic kilometers back to Mexico, and it's also exporting 1.17 to China, which is also getting 0.6 from India. So you can track that trade, and essentially not only track the food trade, track the water that's embedded in it. Now, if you look around the periphery of that system, the top 10 importers are bolded, and the top 10 exporters of embedded groundwater are underlined. Now you look over the left here, you'll see Saudi Arabia, that's bolded and underlined, which means it's one of the top importers and the top exporters. So, why does this matter? Well, we're a country that already imports around 90% of our food. Much of the Middle East imports 90% of its food. And studies like this, you see that a significant portion of that comes from farmland that relies on non-renewable and depleting groundwater. This is a real life case study in food and water insecurity. Now, the food and water security matters of national concern for every country, right? But probably none more so than in our own region for reasons I just explained. But how much water do we actually use in the kingdom? And how much of this is used in agriculture? And where do we get that water from? And is it sustainable? Well, if you're going to try and understand the food and water security aspects, these are some of the questions you need to answer. And they're some of the questions that my group focuses on. Now, what I'm showing here are just some high density irrigated agricultural fields that you can see in many countries, but this one in particular is from Saudi Arabia. Now, each of these fields, and if you do a very quick count, there's about 700 or so of them, they're around 800 meters in diameter. And every one of them consumes about an Olympic-sized swimming pool of water per day. 50 meters by 20 meters by 2 meters, basically twice the size of the IRC pool of water every day. And that's a lot of water. And we've estimated over the last year or two that these pivot fields that are growing food in the kingdom for local and international consumption, they use around 25 cubic kilometers of groundwater. for irrigation each year. So it was actually a really important study that quantified really accurately for the first time that volume of water being used to produce agricultural products. Now, interestingly, that's 10 times as much water as we produce for desalination. Now, we only produce around 2 cubic kilometers of water from all the desalination plants in the kingdom, but we consume more than 20 to produce some of our food. And that has a consequence. And what I'm showing here is the result of that intensive pumping of water to irrigate our crops on the subsequent groundwater resources. The top panel shows the rapid expansion of agriculture that we've seen in Saudi Arabia over the last few decades. You know, basically from nothing to the intensive types of irrigated agricultural areas that I just showed. Now, at the bottom, you can see the resulting groundwater depletion. When we started this work, you know, probably 5 years or more ago, I was really surprised at how much we didn't know about water use, you know, let alone the types of crops we were growing or the amounts of product being produced. And one of the reasons we don't know much about the water is actually pretty simple. It's not something that's actively measured, right? But you'd think it'd be a pretty important thing to measure. So why wouldn't we be measuring it? Well, you know, naturally, we tend to only keep count of things that we value. In a system where water is largely free, you know, where's the incentive to monitor and measure what we use, or you know, how much we could save? Now, to be clear, this is not just a problem here; it's a problem everywhere. Almost without exception, wherever there is groundwater being used for irrigation, it's being depleted, and often at alarming rates. Now, if we are to be sustainable about our water use and by proxy our food production, the first thing we need to do is be able to measure and monitor them. So a lot has been written about feeding the world, and I've listed here a really, you know, some great articles over the last decade for your reference later if you want to go back and revisit them or learn. These are really approachable, relatively short papers that put this big problem into context. There's been a range of solutions that have been proposed as well, you know, genetics and genomics, plant-based meats, alternative sources of protein, you know, big shifts in dietary patterns. You know, we'll talk about a few of those as well. But a common message from all of these studies and subsequent analysis is that we're going to have to learn to do more with less. You know, it's a key aspect of sustainability, do more with less. And we're also going to need to do it a lot smarter than we are currently. You know, going back to the theme of this presentation, the need for a digital transformation in agriculture, you know, I really believe that we'll need to develop and mine new sources of information if we're going to successfully deliver sustainable solutions, whether it's in food and water or across a range of environmental problems. But before going further, I also want to make it pretty clear, you know, there's no single silver bullet, and I don't have a single solution. You know, feeding the world sustainably is a multifaceted problem, and it's going to require a range of approaches. And what will work in one place, you know, is no guarantee is going to be suitable for another. And even though we talk about the global food challenge, it's also a very local problem. So it's really important that we find solutions that are appropriate to the place, but that can scale to similar locations. And digitizing information can help in delivering that kind of scalability and transferability of approach. So there's not much that we do as a species that impacts the planet more than food production. You know, while we've been, you know, incredibly successful at producing more food than ever over the last 50 years or so, you know, more food that we can actually eat, you know, it's come at a cost. It's come at the cost of groundwater depletion, of water pollution, land degradation, you know, loss of biodiversity, and you know, lots of other consequences. And it's pretty obvious we can't continue on that path. Well, it should be pretty obvious that we can't continue on that path. Now, one approach that's been proposed to address food security without adversely affecting the planet is the idea of sustainable intensification. Now, for the purposes of this talk, my simplified definition of this is that we want to produce more food from the same area without degrading the natural environment. Now, given that agriculture is the single largest driver of environmental change, figuring out how to grow more food without destroying the planet, it's a pretty important goal. Jonathan Foley, he actually gave another talk to our NC students back in May. So again, this is one of the benefits of this coronavirus lockdown is that we've been able to get some incredible speakers deliver some amazing talks remotely. So again, this is another one I'd encourage you to go and find on YouTube, and we may be able to post the link in this presentation somehow. But anyway, Jonathan authored a land map paper back in 2011, and I'm going to borrow some of the concepts from that to outline some of these sustainable intensification goals. And one of the first aspects is that we kind of obviously need to stop agricultural expansions. As I mentioned already, we've already cleared a third of the Earth's surface for agricultural food production. It's about actually the size of South America just to grow the crops that feed our world. And that area doesn't actually include the pasture lands we use to raise livestock. Now, much of this land clearing is happening now in our tropical forests, which are kind of important in their own way. And it's really, it's worth noting as well, I guess, that the cleared land in these tropical systems, they don't actually contribute to food security. They're producing soybeans for livestock or timber or palm oil. It's not for direct human consumption. And that's another aspect we need to address as well. And this image explores that idea a bit further. This is an image from Jonathan's paper back in 2011. It shows the fraction of the world's total cropland that's dedicated to growing food crops. Crops that are directly consumed by people versus all other crop uses. Crop uses for animal feed, for fiber, for bioenergy production, or other products. As a global average, approximately 60% of total crop production, on a mass basis at least, is allocated to human food. 35% goes to animal feed, and the remainder is bioenergy crops and other industrial products. But what's interesting is to see how that percentage changes or varies around the world, and that's what we see here. So in North America and Europe, it's around 40%. Whereas if you look at Africa and Asia, they typically allocate 80% of their cropland to food crops. And as a general rule, in looking at this figure, richer countries use croplands for things other than providing food for human consumption. Now, if we're looking at ways to sustainably feed the world, feeding animals instead of humans is probably one of those things that we also need to address. Now, if we're not going to use more land, we're going to stop agricultural expansion, we obviously need to do more with the land that we have. And to do that, we need to close something called the yield gap. And the yield gap is the difference between what could potentially be harvested from a field compared to what is actually grown. And it varies obviously by country and by country's income. More developed nations have a smaller yield gap than the developing nations. And closing this yield gap, particularly in developing countries, could increase global food production by upwards of 50%, a major leap in meeting future food demand. And it really represents a low-hanging fruit, particularly because it's one where technologies such as satellite-based precision agriculture that my team work on and that many others around the world do can play a big role. And again, I'll give some examples of that in a little bit after we get through some of this background. Now, to close yield gap, we need to produce more food more efficiently. Basically the concept of more crop per drop. Now, while the green revolution that we've gone through over the last 50 years or so relied on intensive and unsustainable use of irrigation, fertilizers, pesticides, the next revolution is probably going to be driven by data, or it needs to be driven by data, by prescriptive farming, basically identifying the right amount of water, nutrients, and fertilizers to put in the right place at the right time to maximize yields. And we're just not doing this at the moment. We're producing more food than ever before, but at the cost of more land, more water, more fertilizer, more degradation. It's not sustainable. If we're going to reverse this trend, we have to be a lot smarter about how we produce our food. We're going to have to develop information resources that give us new insights into our agricultural systems, insights that we can act upon to make the changes in our food production systems that are needed. Now, of all the things we can do, of all the things I've just talked about, this is probably the most impactful. We currently waste around 1/3 of food. It's either discarded, spoiled, or is eaten by pests. And that also includes almost half of all fruit and vegetables. Half of almost all fruit and vegetables are wasted. And this is not just a first world problem. Both high and low income countries waste a similar amount of food. That surprises many. But the difference is in how we waste it. In sub-Saharan Africa, 80% is lost during production, handling, and storage. Only 5% is lost due to consumer behavior. In North America and Europe, more than 60% is wasted by consumers. 5% versus 60%, depending on where you live and your income. Now, tackling waste is probably one of the most obvious and effective ways of increasing food availability, increasing food security, and making food production more sustainable. Now, as consumers, we're the ones that are largely to blame for this waste. This is not something that's some externality. This is us. The cosmetic appearance of fruits and vegetables is one of the craziest of factors in food waste. It may be some primeval, unconscious bias where we prefer better looking fruit, but consumer choice affects food production along the entire processing chain from the farm to the market. It's not just something that happens at the market, it happens at the farm level. Around 20% of harvested fruits and vegetables don't even leave the farm because they're not sellable. Suppliers won't buy them. They might be the wrong size, the wrong shape, the wrong color. Anything that doesn't fit a predefined level of attractiveness is discarded. Now, there are a few companies that are trying to address this, and even some startups where you can buy some of these discarded or ugly fruit. But the French supermarket chain Intermarché started a campaign back in 2014 where you get, I think it was 30% off of these ugly fruit and vegetables. Now, it was a huge success. So there's a consumer appreciation for it. So it's positive in that we've got evidence that consumers can change their behavior. So if you're looking for a personal sustainable action, this is a great one. Eat ugly food. But it's not just food waste, it's what we eat that matters as well. And as countries get wealthier, they tend to eat more meat. That's a big problem going forward. It's not necessarily the 2 billion people in those developed countries, it's the richer portion of that are driving these food increases. And as we eat more meat, it means that more of our crops go to feed animals, not humans. Now, apart from the health concerns that obvious health concerns with eating fewer vegetables and more meat, there are water, land, pollution, and the sustainable issues that I've talked about before that come into play as our diets shift towards greater meat consumption. Now, I already mentioned the concept of virtual water, and you can see from this slide some of the main players in that inverted food-water pyramid. We have the healthy eating food pyramid on the left, which you're all familiar with, but there's an inverted pyramid on the right, which is the water use entrapped. in some of these food products. And healthier foods often use less water, so it's a win-win. And while we know there's an obvious link between human health and the food we eat, our planetary health is directly related to that as well. There was a 2019 Eat Lancet report, which you should all have a look at. It makes explicit the fact that human health and planetary health is absolutely integrated. They identify that food's the single strongest lever that we have to optimize both human health and environmental sustainability. And it presented a pretty simple message, and I'm summarizing a bit here, but we basically need to double the consumption of healthy foods, double our personal consumption of healthy foods like fruits, vegetables, nuts, and more than halve the consumption of unhealthy foods, such as those with added sugar and red meat. And they identified sustainable intensification as the approach. That's the one they advocated to deliver human health while minimizing the cost to our planet. Now, for a sector that employs 1 in every 6 people on Earth and represents a $2.4 trillion industry, agriculture and the food production system is in many ways still stuck in the dark ages. If we're going to address some of the issues that I've brought up, these major issues, we're going to need information and management systems to guide us. We're going to need a digital transformation. Now, to be clear, this is not just about collecting more data. We already collect more data than ever before. Something like 90% of the world data was created in just the last 2 years. And that's been true for the last decade or more. But even though our data volumes have increased, I don't think we're necessarily smarter for it. We haven't become incredibly more efficient at some of these optimization schemes that we need for sustainable production because of that large volume of data. We certainly haven't become as smart as we need to be. If we're going to achieve a sustainable intensification of agriculture, we need local level knowledge. This is, if there's a take-home message, it's going to be this: local level knowledge delivered at the planetary scale. We basically need to know everything, everywhere, all the time. And that's possible with the types of data that we're starting to collect, particularly our satellite-based information. Now, a few years ago, I published a paper that looked at some of the emerging technologies that are going to reshape the field of Earth observation, in the near term, the next 5 to 10 years. Basically the tools and techniques that will drive and deliver the data deluge we've been witnessing over this last decade. Now, one of those was the use of satellites that observe the Earth. Satellites launched by space agencies such as NASA or the European Space Agency, but increasingly also private companies like Google and Facebook. Now, the private sector goal is obviously different to the public sectors. They mostly want to exploit an untapped market. Bringing the internet or bringing wireless connectivity to the 2 billion people who don't already have it. It's an untapped market. But as it turns out, they're mostly the same 2 billion people who struggle with food and water security. So these new sensing platforms provide an opportunity. Now, the idea that I mentioned in the last slide, local knowledge at the planetary scale, can actually benefit from these sorts of public and private sector efforts. Maybe it's an unintended consequence of that. Now, one technology that I'm going to touch on briefly, and there are many that I could talk about, but I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to focus on CubeSats. And the concept is actually pretty simple. Instead of launching a single billion-dollar satellite, which is the traditional approach that NASA or ESA might explore, you launch hundreds, a constellation of smaller and cheaper systems. And what this enables is a shift not only in how detailed you can image the Earth, but also how often. Now, until recently, if you wanted to use satellite data, you generally had to make a compromise. Well, this has been true for the vast proportion of my career. You had to make a compromise between how often you could see something and how well you could see it. You couldn't have it both ways. It was either see it, in great detail occasionally, or see it regularly, but poorly. CubeSats have changed that equation. They've collapsed that compromise. You no longer need to make it. Now you can see something with great detail pretty much every day, in some cases even sub-daily. And that gives us a great opportunity to track and monitor our food and water systems in ways that previously haven't been possible at the individual field scale. It allows us a foot in the door to get local knowledge at the global planetary scale. Now, when my group first started working with this data, and literally probably only 5 years ago, we had to address some problems. You had hundreds of different satellites, all with their own unique sensitivities, their own errors. You had gaps from slightly different orbits. It wasn't seamless data that you could just use and develop a product from. We had to find a way to merge and harmonize them. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this. There's papers that you can explore. There's probably other talks as well. But I will show a video of what we ended up with. This is kind of the most recent development from one of the private sector companies that are pioneering these CubeSat applications, Planet. So I'll just play this and continue talking. You can see a seamless kind of harmonized gap-free product, no clouds, no orbital tracks. And what that allows is a way to start asking questions that address some of the sustainable intensification issues we've been talking about. Now, in the next few slides, I want to show you a few examples of the types of food and water informatics that my team here at KAUST and elsewhere have been developing from these types of data. Not CubeSats solely, but satellite data generally. Now, in this example, we're using CubeSats to track crop development every day at high resolution to identify problems or issues that might be occurring in a field. Problems or issues as they occur. Now, remember, these fields are about 800 meters in diameter. And, to give you some perspective on that, if you were to walk along the length of the spine one way and then back the other way, that's around 800 meters. Now, as a farmer, you simply can't stand at the side of the field and see if there's a problem somewhere in it, especially if you have a few hundred of these to manage. Now, if you want to know what's happening in the field and then be able to take action to fix a problem, you need high resolution imagery every day. And information like this enables decisions to be made in a timely manner, which is absolutely key if we want to try and address some of those sustainable intensification aspects, like closing the yield gap or applying our resources in an efficient way across the field. Now, you can also use that data to track plant phenology or to figure out planting and harvesting times. Basically identify the key stages of development and maturity within a crop cycle. Now, why would we want to know that? Well, that's the very type of information you need to not just make informed fields at the field level, but also for national scale food security. To give you an example, if you can track the rate of crop growth, which is what we're seeing here, that can give you information to make more accurate forecasts of yield. A key metric for food security. You want to know how much you're going to be able to forecast at the end of the season. Now, even today, something as fundamental as knowing the type of crop being grown, let alone how much you might expect to yield, it doesn't exist at the scales, the time scales that we need to make food security forecasts. Again, this is precisely the type of information we need, local knowledge at the planetary scale. Now, getting this type of information is critical everywhere, but particularly in developing countries. So we produced estimates of crop water use, the amount of water being used to grow any particular crop, which is a key variable for water security. Now, knowing this has implications not just for agricultural water monitoring, which was what drove our motivation for us doing it, but also sustainable water management. Now, remember, we were talking about virtual water and the fact that we don't keep track of it because we don't value it. or we don't value it because it's largely free. It doesn't have a price. But if you did want to put a value on water, a price per litre used or a certain allocation to each farmer to pump, data like this gives you a global licensing and compliance framework to measure how much a farmer might be using versus how much they've been allocated. And if you want to reduce water to achieve more crop per drop or help to close that yield gap I mentioned before, this is the information you need. Now, again, the ultimate goal here is local knowledge at the planetary scale. We want to measure and understand every field, everywhere, all the time. You know, it's a big data analytics problem, right? But even with all the data collection platforms we have available to us, it still surprises me how much we don't know about our agricultural systems, about our food production systems. We just take them for granted. For example, something as simple as the number of fields in a country. You know, how many center pivots a particular country might have, let alone how many there are in the world. That's a statistic that's really hard to find because in many places it just doesn't exist. Now, if you don't know something as simple as the number of fields, you don't know what crops are being grown, how much is being produced, or as the last slide explored, how much water is being used to grow all that food. All of which you fundamentally need to know to make any progress towards achieving food or water security. Now, even though we're increasingly data rich, we're information poor. We need to be able to turn the data into information that can be used for the purposes that we want. In this case, sustainable intensification, the improvement of our food production systems. And we recently completed the first phase of a ministry project to map and monitor agricultural water use throughout the kingdom. Now, this involved identifying every unique centre pivot field, and there are about 35,000 of them, over multiple years, determining crop water use rates and then inferring the groundwater abstracted to irrigate those. Now, by doing that, we were able to quantify for the first time precisely how much groundwater was being used to produce food. And that then allows you to determine whether it's sustainable or not. The next phase is obviously expand this to other regions around the world, because again, that information just doesn't exist, at least not in a timely fashion to make some of the decisions that we need to make at the moment. And that's the real power and potential of Earth observation and big data analytics, getting you information you need to make decisions. Now, that's something we refer to as actionable intelligence. It's a nice phrase to describe what we're trying to do. Now, I think this is my last slide, so I wanted to wrap up things a little bit. But just to clarify, that actionable intelligence, it's more than just turning data into useful and usable metrics, even though that's, you know, super important. It's also about getting it into the hands of people who can use it, you know, and getting it to them in a timely manner. There's no point knowing how much food was produced a year later. We need to know now. We need to be able to forecast to the end of season. And this has been driven by a range of sensing platforms. It's not just satellites or UAVs, you know, two things that we do a lot of in my group, but it's a range of other in situ systems. It's wearables, you know, on plant, on animal sensors. It's really the Internet of Things applied to earth and environmental science. And this is really the forefront of sensing, turning the data into decisions. It's an incredibly important area as students that hopefully you can all consider going into, because we need information. We need to be able to harness that data deluge to use it and turn it into something that we can make smart and successful decisions on. But it's really going to be one of the pathways towards delivering sustainable intensification. Now, digital transformation, even though I've only talked about one particular aspect of that, it really could capture everything that happens between the farm and the fork. You have traceability of food supplies, fraud detection, origin certification, waste production, all of the things that we talked about in broad terms. Nearly all of them require this type of intense digitization of the food system to be able to analyze and integrate that into a sustainable approach. So if there's a concluding message for my presentation, I guess it's this: we need a digital transformation now, not in 30 years, so that we can answer the 10 billion people question of the future. That's the end of my presentation, and I'd be very happy to take any questions or comments that the audience might have.
Thank you very much, Professor McCabe, for this very interesting presentation. We have indeed a couple of questions that pop up in the Q&A. So I think maybe Michelle, you can ask directly yourself. Let's see if she answers. Otherwise, I will be reading the question for you.
So sorry, you want me to answer them myself? I missed that.
So I think she will first ask them, because also for our recording it's better, and then you can answer.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Can you? Oh, sorry. Mute yours, Nico. Okay. Sorry, we were just echoing. I just wanted to ask, how important do you think it is to reduce animal agriculture, and if there's even a reason we should be continuing the production when it's not something that's necessary to feed our population?
Sorry, Michelle, I'm having trouble hearing your question.
Oh, sorry. Use your microphone.
Should I read it here? I can see it in the Q&A.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
So there's two questions, right? Could you please address food waste in the system? We waste over half the food we produce. Should there be a focus on reducing it? Yeah, absolutely. Was this asked before? Maybe before I presented it. So absolutely, food waste is a key. A third of the food we produce, but 50% of fruits and vegetables. It's crazy. And I think if you go back to the talk, you'll see the spatial map of how we waste our food, and the way that the developed world or richer nations waste more of their food than developing nations. We waste about the same, but it's how we waste it. In the Western world, for richer countries, we dispose of a lot of it. In poorer countries, it's this storage and distribution that causes a loss. So there's two different approaches here that we need to address. This kind of goes back to the very first statement I made about finding appropriate solutions for appropriate places. There's no point focusing on a consumer-driven food waste strategy in Africa when that's not the cause. It's only 5% of food being wasted there. We need to develop infrastructures for storage and distribution. Yeah, that's a big problem. In developed countries where we're wasting so much food, not just through the food that we throw out at home, but across the processing chain. It really amazes me, and I've had firsthand dealings with this, where farmers can't sell their product to suppliers because it doesn't meet a particular grade or particular standard. The USDA, you can go to the USDA website and they have whole PDFs on food grade and quality. It's crazy. It's as consumers, it should be unacceptable. So, efforts like Intermarsh, but there are new startups that actually are developing packaging of ugly fruit that they source from suppliers that otherwise can't sell it. These are great initiatives, but they're not initiatives that are going to work in Africa. It's not a problem there. They're initiatives that other countries that, where we live now and other Western countries that I think will have the biggest impact. Now, you asked two questions. Why should we continue to feed and use animals when we can gain all the nutrition we need to feed the population? Well, yeah. This is a tough one. And I mean tough because it comes down to individual ethical choices, right? In an ideal world, we would all be vegetarian, and that would cut out 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions pretty much immediately, even discounting the animal welfare issues. But I'm not a vegetarian. I'm talking about this stuff here in a presentation, and I'm very conscious of the fact that when I eat meat, I'm consuming a disproportionate amount of not only water, but food that's gone into the production of that. The per calorie content of eating meat versus eating the vegetables and legumes or nuts, it's not equivalent. So I suspect that how do you solve that? Well, at an individual level, I guess we all need to make a conscious choice of trying to reduce our intake. I think the Eat Lancet report does a really nice job of drawing parallels between healthy living and healthy diet and the planetary health. That's something that's relatively new in consciousness, is being able to bring those two concepts together. I think that's a good way of getting people to change their behavior. But perhaps the biggest approach, if you're not going to get people to change their ethical behavior, is I mentioned it a bit in the talk, is to put a value on water in the first place. We don't have water for agriculture is largely free. Now, if you put a nominal value on the water that's used in agriculture, that would be an immediate incentive to save it. Now, it may propagate in increased food prices, which is not a great thing either. So I'm not sure that an economic solution is a solution either. But it's a complicated problem. But individually, I think we all have a role to play in adjusting our choices, given the statistics I presented here already. Okay, so Annie, do you want me to just go through these questions?
Yes, I mean, I think then the second question was from Gabrielle about if you had any data about quinoa and water use.
All right, where's that one?
A little bit lower because then they were having some discussion. I will also unmute you, Gabby, if you want to.
Well, I can't see that one, sorry. So maybe okay. It was, the one I see is, Annie's got one. When I lived in Switzerland, in most supermarkets, there was a section, of weird-shaped veggies and fruits at discounted price. We should value those and nothing. Absolutely. And I think the example I showed before for Intermarché is good. I wish I could remember the startup that is doing it. It's only quite recent. All right, Michelle provides over 8%. Provides a comment. I'm assuming everyone can read these questions and answers, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the next question after this discussion between Michelle and Annie was Gabby, that she was asking if you had any data about quinoa.
Quinoa.
And what we use, yes.
Well, yeah, that's a good question, actually. So, Mark Tester is doing a lot of work with quinoa, and it's obviously a potential. It's viewed as one of these superfoods and a potential solution to, feeding the global population, particularly because it can be grown on a range of poor quality water and poor quality soils. So we're actually having we have ongoing projects here at KAUST, right at the moment, where we're trying to map the health and condition of quinoa plants. So, do I have any results on that? Not yet, because the data is still being analysed. But we have done a field trial here, and I know Mark has extensive field trials around the world where we're using UAV and satellite data to help with the phenotyping of quinoa varieties, basically trying to identify which ones might perform best, or which accessions of quinoa might perform best in particular conditions. But Mark's approach of looking at how quinoa grows across a range of environments is absolutely key, right? Because going back to that point before, we've got to find not only solutions that are appropriate to local conditions, but crops and other foodstuffs that can be grown in those conditions, particularly when you can consider climate change in that equation as well. Laurent has asked, what is your opinion about indoor farming with aeroponics, which uses much less water than regular agriculture? Is this the future? Yeah, it's a good question. Is aeroponics or controlled environment agriculture or vertical farming the solution? There'll be people that disagree with me, but I don't think it is. I think it's a partial solution, and there's no problem with that. I've talked all about partial solutions, but they use less water, they use less nutrients, and we can recycle a lot of that, but there's also a lot of energy use that goes into controlled environment agriculture as well. And at least some of the studies I've seen on energy uses, particularly as you scale up, that's not going to solve part of that interlinked sustainability aspect. The other issue is the type of food that you can grow in these types of environments. You know, we can't live on lettuce and strawberries. You know, we need our staple crops, and until staple crops are growing in controlled environment agriculture, which I don't see many great examples of, you're certainly not going to be able to feed the world. Now, is it a partial solution? Maybe. You know, one of the arguments put forward is that they reduce transport costs. Well, actually, the transport part of the equation is not as big an issue as many people think. You know, there's a lot of value in you know, this idea of local versus remote food sourcing. You know, there's when you do the studies on the volumes involved, it's actually not as big a factor as many people consider. But yeah, a partial solution, not the solution. Is there a need? Sorry, I skipped a question. Ji had asked a question. Is there a need for a technological development for proper food storage, control of humidity, temperature at the consumer supermarket? Well, probably not at the consumer supermarket level. I think that bit's pretty well maintained, but certainly the transport and storage of food. I think I've already given a partial answer to this previously when I talked about the geographic distribution of that waste problem. And if we can develop an efficient, cheap, and easily implemented storage solution for food storage and food transport, that would solve some massive problems in the developing world. But yeah, again, I think this is a great example of the multi-directional aspects of this problem. Marcelo, thank you for your, all right, good. One quick question. Recently, I read about we produce just a small percentage of the whole types of edible crops that we have. What are the reasons for that? And how can we encourage to plant different types of crops that probably, all right, that we probably do not know? Okay. So I think what you mean is that when we talk about the resilience of our food security system, or our food supply systems, I should say, we don't actually grow a huge amount of crops. And you're right, you know, there's 4 staple crops. There's, you know, wheat, rice, maize, and barley. And if I remember correctly, something like, you know, pretty much 90% of our food supply system, maybe more, there's 12 different crops and 5 different animal products. And, you know, if you're looking at it as a systems perspective and as for potential critical weaknesses in our food supply, you know, having only 12 food crops and 5 animal products is probably a bit of a weakness in our food safety and security. So expanding for different types of crop types, absolutely. You know, that's very important. Having a more, you know, heterogeneous source of foods that we can access, foods that are, you know, nutritious and, you know, use less water, can be grown on marginal soils and with marginal water. You know, these are some of the big advances. And I think, you know, the Centre for Desert Agriculture is exploring aspects of that problem. We talked about quinoa, but there are others as well. So yes, the answer to that question is yes. Are efforts being made, sorry, Philip Mitchell, are efforts being made towards topsoil conservation in Saudi Arabia? Yeah, good question. Are statistics being collected on topsoil depletion in the country? So yeah, we're losing topsoil. We're losing the health of our, you know, the inherent health of our agricultural soils, not just in Saudi Arabia, the world over. And this is a very, very important part of the food security problem, is how do we restore our healthy soils? How do we promote healthy soils? Now, are efforts happening in Saudi Arabia? Not that I'm aware of. And are statistics being collected? Not that I'm aware of. But again, that's true for many countries. Topsoil is just not something that we are taking as seriously as we need to. I think there are some efforts that we will see in the coming years, and well, in the near term. I know we have a project as part of the Circular Carbon Initiative that KAUST recently launched to explore approaches that help entrap carbon in nature-based solutions, and one of those is in our agricultural soils. How do we improve the soil organic content of soils? Are there microbiome approaches that we can use to enhance the productivity of soils? All of these are absolutely critically important to sustaining our food and water systems. Again, a great example of the multidisciplinary interlinked nature of these. Diego, thank you for the interesting talk. No, you're welcome. Somehow related to the economic valuation of water for agricultural use, what are some of your thoughts on water futures entering the stock market? Well, gosh, you could give a whole talk on this. I'm a little bit worried about it. So this is the idea: is you can take out a futures option on the price of water or the availability of water. You can basically develop financial instruments on anything you want. And there's a lot of argument on how you value water, and is it a public good or is it a private, open to the private sector to exploit? And I think there's elements of both. It's not one or the other. It probably needs to be both. It's going to be very difficult to convince the private sector to go in and install, hundreds of thousands of kilometres of irrigation in Africa. That's going to be something that international agencies are going to need to do. But at the same time, the private sector has been shown to not be particularly great custodians of our groundwater resources. There's a handful of companies that exploit the vast majority of groundwater systems for their own purposes. The bottled water debacle over the last several decades is a great example of that. You take an absolutely free product and convince people that they need to buy it. And it's one of these crazy consumer-driven elements again. Who's responsible for that? Well, I don't blame the private sector in that regard. I blame us. I blame the consumer. There's no reason to be drinking bottled water, but that's what we're doing. All right, so there's some questions in the chat.
Yes, exactly. Perfect.
I should keep going on these?
Yeah.
Yep.
If you have time, it would be great.
All right, how can policies enforced by governments change the current, this is from Tana. Oh yeah, I know Tana. How can policies enforced by governments change the current status of food and water waste, pro-environment laws, other than raising the price? Yeah. All right, in other words, how can governments force corporations to be environmentally efficient? Well, yeah, this is a tough question. And Tana probably knows more about it than me. But I think there's plenty of examples of governments introducing legislation and policies to protect the environment. That's happened since the 70s. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. We do it already with water pollution and air pollution. I don't think it's a big stretch for governments to enforce policies that, to enact and then force the policing of policies that protect our water supplies. We have them in place. Most countries have water acts. Saudi Arabia has a very comprehensive water act. But is it up to the government to protect our environment? Absolutely. The government is an instrument of the people for the most part. So if the people demand it, the government should do it. Is it the only way? There's other approaches. There's shareholder activism. If you've got a private sector industry or a private sector company that's going about environmental problems in a poor way or in a poor manner, shareholder activism has been a shareholder activism. Shareholder activity has been a great deterrent for those private sector industries to do that. So I think it's a combination of both again. If I'm repeating myself, I apologize, but there's no single solution to any of these problems. That's the message, is that they're multifaceted. They're going to require multiple different approaches, and we're going to have to try some things before we figure out whether they work or not. There's no harm in trying something and seeing that it doesn't work and trying something different. That's the nature of progress. So yeah, policies developed by government, informed by science, are central to environmental protection. Is sustainable intensification achievable? The concept seems too ideal. Can you elaborate more on that? Well, yeah, I hope it's achievable because there's not a lot of great other options. I think the principles that I talked about are absolutely achievable. We can stop agricultural expansion, and our agricultural expansion has slowed down, considerably over the last several decades. But it's going to slow down one way or another. There's a natural limit to how much land we can convert for usable agriculture. We have to use resources more efficiently. I guess the question could probably better phrase is how quickly are we going to be doing these things before they're forced upon us? I don't think there's an alternative. Is the short answer. They may be difficult, but I don't consider it as an alternative. We can't continue producing food and wasting food in the ways that we are doing that now. So is it achievable? I think so. I absolutely think so. Certainly from the perspective of this talk, we have the infrastructure in place. The digital infrastructure is mostly in place. And it's going to be increasingly so as we roll out, the Internet of Things, other data collection efforts. That's not the limiting factor here. The limiting factor is instituting these changes, making the connections. The concept seems ideal. I don't think it seems ideal. I think it's common sense. We've got to change the way that we do things, and that's either going to be a decision we make on our own preemptively, or it's going to be a decision that's forced upon us by the constraints of the Earth system. I prefer that we do the former than wait for the latter. I think that's all the questions.
Yes, I think so too. Thank you very much again to take extra time to answer to all these questions and for this very interesting presentation again.
It was a shame that we couldn't do it in person, but
yes.
Again, I think if anyone wants to go and revisit some of those talks that we were able to invite some really eminent speakers this year, that's been a real positive of these types of Zoom experiences. Go and have a look at the talks of John Foldy and Jay Femiglietti. They do a much better job than I do at explaining some of these details.
Okay, yes, we will try to share the links. But thank you again, and thank you everyone. Thanks, Iman, for coming up with this very great initiatives. And everyone enjoy a nice winter break, hopefully, that we won't get stuck too long. But yes, have a good day. Bye. Thank you again, Professor.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.